Hello, welcome to another BAPT in Conversation webinar. I'm Richard Owen, the current treasurer and a trustee of the BAPT, that's the British Association for Psychological Type. We're a member organisation that promotes knowledge and practice of psychological type. I'm really pleased to have here today one of the best known authors, trainers and practitioners and innovators within this psychological type field. Been very busy for the last few decades creating models and products and books and ways to help people engage with psychological type. So happy to welcome Linda Berens. Hi, Linda.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you along. I've been really looking forward to this conversation, and it'd be great to start off and just see a little bit about kind of what work you're doing currently today and a bit about the journey of how you got where you are in your career.
Okay, well, I do get caught up in history sometimes, so I'll feel free to cut me off.
Yeah, so can you just start with now? I mean, I imagine you're still working today, and with your daughter as well, training in type in your lenses model, InterStrength CORE approach. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Mostly, well, for the last several years, all online. COVID just opened up that window, and I had already been doing it that way. And so even the consulting stuff that I do is still online. So.
So just maybe go back to the early days. You know, where did you first start your training in psychology, and where did it all begin?
Well, it began when I took a master's degree in school counsel. It was a master's in counseling was the title, but it was for school counselors. So I was an elementary school teacher, credentialed. I didn't teach many days, just did substitute teaching. Didn't really like that, decided I would see what else there was. And the placement office at the university said, "Oh, they're hiring school counselors." Okay, so I'll go get this degree. So I wound up in this program at Cal State Fullerton, a part of the university system in California, and David Kersey was the architect, and Marilyn Bates was the primary driver of this program. And one day in the psychopathology class, one evening, we started learning about different ways people go crazy, to put it loosely. and so there was one on, well, I'll use my names now. So there was a 3-hour class on the stabilizers or SJ preference folk, what they're like when they are having mental problems, when they become somewhat dysfunctional. And the last 20 minutes was, here's what they're like when things are going well for them. And then we had, one for the improviser, which we call improviser, SP preferences, and one night for the theorist or the NT preferences, and one for the catalyst or NF preferences. So we had these 4 lectures. And then, well, we were all really curious in the class. And I was telling David Kersey I thought I was the wrong kind of person to become a teacher. And then he said, well, no, the best teacher he knew had INTJ preferences. So he didn't use that preferences language, but that's my preference to get away from labeling. Anyway, so I took the Myers-Briggs, and it apparently was pretty accurate. So, because I would say it still fits the INTP preferences. Mm-hmm. And my husband and I, it turns out, had already taken that, but the psychologist never, back in early marriage counseling, psychologists never interpreted it or verified it or anything. And he gave us a battery of tests. So I went back to him and asked him how we scored. And I told him what I was up to, and I was looking for, do I want to go deeper into psychology? What do I want to do? And my results were the same with him, I think. And my husband reported INFP, but that's not what fits him either. So that was it. And then Yves DeLunas was one of the adjunct professors in that program, and there were several people who were into type, and I think it was 1980, they put on a conference primarily for school psychologists and school counselors, but anybody, and David spoke, and I think maybe Alan Brownsword came and spoke. I can't remember. But, and after that, 1981, I've been to every APTI conference since. The ones that were in the US. I haven't been to all the others, in Europe, Australia, but I've been to a few.
So after you did this study with David Keirsey, that clearly had quite an impact on your work through the temperaments model. At what point did you really realize the value of psychological type approaches in a way that would then go on to influence your career, to follow that as a major influence?
Well, as I was, starting out as a school psychologist, and then I could help kids with it. In the background, I never gave, maybe one bright student who was really interested and who read Please Understand Me cover to cover. But mostly I would just interpret test results in terms of the psychological difference of the students. And I did some training of the teachers on individual differences. So now I forgot what the question was.
Just to see at what point you kind of realized the value of it, and that, when did you really see the kind of power of the insights that people get from these sort of models?
Oh, I think I saw it right away. It was very powerful for me. And I went into business with somebody who graduated with me in our master's program, and we were active in the Association for Psychological Type. And once I got my doctorate, we decided that we would go into private practice together, but the idea was to take type to the world. And a consultant that she knew suggested we target the big 8 CPA firms. That's how long ago there were 8. And we decided to do that. And she decided that didn't work for her. And I decided that didn't work for me either, because I just wasn't comfortable in suits and white shirts. So, and that whole way you have to deal with that particular target market. And then, so I did some more private practice stuff, but it just, well, especially with temperament, I could tell, because we were taught what goes wrong when their core psychological needs aren't getting met. So then it gave me practical things to suggest to teachers and parents to do differently, and with clients to help them understand themselves and validate that, plus what their talents are that would help them get those needs met. So, and by that time, I was hooked already. And it was a growing field. There were, I was at 81, so lots of, more and more kinds of activities to do. We had a local chapter with 2,000 people in the mailing list. And so just involvement. So it just always, to this day, it's the most useful tool I learned, besides maybe how to listen.
That's interesting. And from speaking with you earlier, you said you did your PhD in psychology, and you were exposed to a whole load of different models and psychology theories. So did type really stand out to you?
Yeah, so in my master's program is where I was actually learned a lot more than I did in my doctorate. My doctorate was just kind of going through the hoops. And I learned some things, but it wasn't all that much. But we learned a model, an intervention model, a week. So it was Carl Rogers, Fritz Perls, Albert Ellis, all of these pioneers who had methodologies that worked. And David Kersey's understanding and belief was that they would happen, these healers would happen upon something that worked. And then they would write about it. And that was the theory. So we learned in each week during the methods class, what does the therapist do? And there was like a 30-minute lecture, maybe a little more. Then we would get into practice groups. It's kind of like the way we teach online these days. We got into practice groups where we had to practice that. And then so we learned those things. We learned some other things you have to learn, like career counseling tools and things for the schools, especially. And then after that, we had to finish up the course was a 6-unit class that was just practicum. And you didn't go to class, you just practiced. And then you did a video or an audio recording of what it was and what you did with, your friends being clients, etc. And we had to demonstrate competency in it. So that model of what does the therapist do, and then the whole model that helps you identify how to help people get their needs met. That was the main thing. And I think mainly out of all those methodologies, probably it was the listening from more than the methodologies, how to listen, that was the most helpful, which is, how does a type professional help someone find their best fit? By asking good questions and listening, not by giving tests.
Mm. Yeah, it's powerful. And it's interesting. It's a distinction to that from, like you said, how you first experienced type doing the tests, the paper tests.
Yeah.
So when you took the idea of the temperaments and you developed eventually what's now the InterStrength CORE approach with all the different lenses. Tell me how that first came about, the evolution of you using the temperament theory and creating essential motivators and renaming things. How did it all come about? What happened?
Well, okay, so I'll start with the essential motivators, and we called it temperament for a long time, and we used David Kersey's names, and we found that there was a lot of bias against some of those names, so that people didn't want to be. I can't remember now what the words were. Oh dear. So people weren't resonating to the type pattern because the name didn't fit. So who wants to be an artisan? At least in Western culture, mostly an artisan refers to somebody who does manual things. And now I just cringe that I say, who wants to be an artisan? But that's what we found, is that people were turned off. The people who came to the MBTI qualifying programs that we were doing were turned off by that name, artisan, because they were not people who appreciated all of these differences. And so that, and then we found that the word idealist was problematic because in the business world, this guy walks in and saw these charts on the wall that said idealists, and the guy said, "We don't need idealists here. What are they doing in this workshop?" So that prompted us to change the name so that there was less bias, and everybody wanted to be rational. At least in most of the Western culture. And then Guardian was the only one that worked pretty well. because it seemed to describe the pattern and didn't have a bunch of baggage.
Mm.
So we changed the names, and then somewhere along the line, I can't remember when, we decided to call the model something different.
Mm.
So, and then in truth, Kersey's family had some issues. They were pretty protective, and they said I didn't have a right to use the names. And I told them otherwise, because I do. They weren't trademarked. So, but I just needed to distance from those representations because I thought it was doing harm to use those other names. And when I read the descriptions, that there's bias in some of Kersey's descriptions.
Mm.
And I would say there's probably still some bias in ours. And we were, that's why we're about ready to do 5.0 of the temperament booklet, just because, we get to know these people in our courses and we find out, oh yeah, that's not quite accurate. So we want to, it's always about improving things.
Mm. Do you still relate that model ultimately back to the quadrants like the MT, NF, SJ, SP that relates to the Myers-Briggs? Or you talked about core needs. Where do you see this really kind of originating from?
Well, I don't know what it was, but I think it was because of the training and the way people become dysfunctional, the psychopathology class that I had. So from the beginning, there are a couple of things that are, I believe, true principles of nature, of living systems. We do what we need to protect ourselves. So in the pathology, it wasn't about these people are crazy and bonkers and totally dysfunctional. It was about here's what they look like when they're not being true to themselves. Like those would not have been David's words, but something like that. And then I was working with the schools because I was a school psychologist. And in that school district, we were working with teachers at the teacher center. And I was training them to do some, curriculum kinds of things. And they were trying to make a handout, with a matrix, right? And it wasn't a true matrix. It was just quadrants with the letters in there. And they were just putting random characteristics. And I said to them, no, it's not like that. It's at their core. And I had this sense in my gut that temperament or essential motivators is core. It's central. And then out of that, instead of those being random characteristics, which are a lot harder to learn because there's no central theme, I developed the targets with the core needs at the middle, and then the values, which are very closely related to the needs, and then the talents, which scratch the itch that the needs create, and then the behaviors. Mm. And so those words are all interrelated, and it doesn't mean that you can see something in there, some characteristic that someone else wouldn't relate to, but the whole pattern has to fit. Mm. And so that's how that came about, was just most of it was out of teaching. Mm. And then realizing that model didn't fit.
So myself and yourself, I think as an NT preference, then what do you think is then at the core that motivates the types with NT preferences then with this?
Well, first of all, is this core psychological need for knowledge, to be knowledgeable, and to have mastery. Mm. So I don't deny that it's important to have a sense of your identity and all of that, but knowledge and mastery win every time if there's ever a competing thing in my mind about what's important. So it's that knowledge and mastery, getting skills. Interestingly, with the theorist with NT preferences and the improviser with SP preferences, both want to be skillful. So for the the improviser, it's skillful performance. And the theorist, it's about knowledge and competence. And, competence and skillful performance, competence is to be able to do, skillful performance is the doing. So sometimes what happens with those with the theorist pattern is that life is a long, long time ongoing acquisition of skills and knowledge. Maybe not applying them, but having them.
Yeah.
So, and then the whole thing is that the stressor for that pattern is to feel incompetent. And then that leads to doing behaviors like obsessing and obsessing. There are a few others, rituals, doing things to distract yourself from not being competent.
I can get that, the sort of constant need to study something else, do another course, do another qualification. I guess it doesn't really end, does it, I suppose?
No, and actually COVID was not stressful for me because of the, not going out. My husband and I, we're quite happy at home. We're not super social beings. I have close relationships with my students online. I had already been doing that for a while, so that was a piece of cake. The stressor is that I had too many. Okay, so I learned to do these courses online with Zoom and with a learning platform back in 2017. Well, but by 1 year or 2 years into COVID, there's a whole lot more being done online. And now I have to say, okay, now what is hybrid learning? How would that work? And oh my God, I don't want to do that because I don't want to be not in the room with the people and have some people in the room. But hybrid has the multiple definitions. But there are all these new technologies to master. And so I really realized that sort of is become a stressor for me. And trying to tell myself, plus we have some mold issues at home, which many people know about, and it's still ongoing. They keep finding more. And, I have some autoimmune issues. So I've now got 3 domains I need to learn how to master. And while it's fun to learn new stuff, it's overwhelming.
Yeah, when you're forced to enter new domains. I can see now, your I guess your background of studying in academia and different models. There is a long list, on your biography. One of them is a holacracy facilitator. I'm really curious about what that is.
Oh, one of my star students who came to every training we did, because we had a learning center. It was really easy to say, oh, let's just, offer this training. We didn't have to deal with hotels. So however many people showed up. And Brian Robertson was about barely drinking age. I don't even think he was old enough to buy liquor, 18, 19, 20, 21, maybe. But anyway, he was fascinated with all of this. And he had this idea from some other things he had learned about having a different way of operating. And he started his own software development company, and he wanted it to be the best, and excellent in terms of money making. I did workshops for them. I would go and there would be a thing, Linda's coming next week on the board. So it's like satisfying and fun. And then he came across sociocracy, which was developed in the Netherlands, I believe. And of course, his pattern is catalyst, so NF patterned, his preferences. And he wanted everything to, people to be highly valued. And he recognized the problems with, in business, with the hierarchy. And so he started working with sociocracy and tweaking it and developed this set of practices for having meetings in business that get the politics out of it. So there are rather rigid rules about governance, what kinds of things you can bring up, what kinds of things you can't, and about tactical meetings, the what to do piece. So I became part of the development of that. And then there was a whole people side of things. And I got started with another startup, which was called encode.org, to encode, which is to get these agreements arranged. So I helped contribute to some arrangements for the people side of things. So any business, there's the investor side, which is the business. There's the doing the work, which holacracy applies to. And then there's the people stuff. And so if you have all these tensions to process, the ones that are about people don't get processed because you don't bring those issues up in those meetings. So we needed ways to do that. And so I got involved with that and traveled to Europe a lot. That was fun.
Mm-hmm.
And Brian implemented this throughout, his understanding of how to create and work with the people, was founded in his understanding of the typology patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So he came to everything I did. And his wife, then fiance did, but wife did. So I spent hours talking type with him.
So that was another kind of part of your journey to competency, mastery, knowledge. Besides all this technology stuff, like what's got your interest nowadays? What's the next thing you're trying to integrate? Is there any other psychology models or anything?
Well, we have the 4 essential motivator patterns, the 4 temperaments, and we had a clues card for that. We a laminated card, and then we had the 4 interaction styles. So that emerged out of trying to relate disc to type, and found out it didn't have a straight, letter thing the same way. So that's where we came out with interaction style. So it's very similar to disc, but it and the social styles. But my attention was, if I'm going to say this about somebody with an in charge interaction style, it has to fit all 4 of the types: ENTJ, ESTJ, ESTP, and ENFJ. So it was about refining and coming up with a language for that. And then it turned out that it met with resistance at first at the conferences, but that became so popular that in and of itself that you can go into an organization, you get buy-in instantly because they're easy to see, get things going, in charge, chart the course behind the scenes. And then Catherine Stothard has her names, and those are fine too. They're a little less colloquial than ours, but they work. So it's been that I had done that. And so we had these 4, and then there was cognitive dynamics, we called it, because the focus was on the 8 functions and then the patterns of those functions based on Beebe's work. And so Chris Montoya is this guy's name, and he said, "Well, where's the 4? We need something with 4." So we talked, and I gave him all of the one-on-one interviews that we did when we interviewed 4 people of each type. And we got 40 pages. And one question: what's it like to be you? And they talked. We recorded it and translated. And I didn't do the interviews. Somebody else did, Stephanie Rogers. Skillful at getting people, people felt very comfortable with her. She felt sometimes like, she'd been given something golden to treasure from them and to protect. Mm-hmm. And so I had 40 pages for each of the 16 types, and I gave him those. And I had already identified this concept in 2003, I think it was, about the tandem dynamics. I had a blog post or 2 on that, so that extroverted feeling and introverted thinking work together in a particular way. So I suggested that he, might want to cluster them that way. And I don't know what he did, but he came back with 4 styles, 4 patterns. And then we've named it cognitive styles. We've named it intentional styles, but we already had interaction styles. So I decided it's intentional drivers, because it has to do with the intentions that you have mentally that you may not be aware of. The sort of the image we have, we had the target for the temperament, the arrow for the interaction styles. The image for this one is a head. And so back of the mind and kind of what you're looking for and kind of what language you might use. So that came out with 4 patterns. And we haven't developed the materials yet, but I've done workshops on it. And it seems to be very powerful for people. So one of the things for me, for example, I would have been tempted to say that it's an INTP thing or a theorist thing to always want to improve. It's not all theorists. Those with those with NTJ preferences, it's not about improving. It's not, it's still wanting to, get good products, but it's about orchestrating all these different inputs so that you get this outcome. And so that pattern, strangely, about what we call orchestrator, is the SFP and the NTJ. And then I often say that inside every SFP is an NTJ, and inside every NTJ is an SFP. And so then it's NTP and SFJ, and then it's NFP and STJ. So the enhancing for NTP as NTP SFJ, authenticating for NFP, and STJ. And when you think about that authenticating, is it authentic? Does it match so that's so much full of extroverted thinking and introverted feeling? And then what's the other one? Who did I leave out? NFJ and STP. And the NFJ and STP, the theme of that one is to customize, to make things fit the situation. It might not be authentic, might not match the kind of the purity of the whatever it is. It might, it would do some enhancing, it would make it a little better. But from my NTP perspective, you've bastardized the theory. What do you think you're doing? But people wind up doing that and they get results. So what can I say?
It's curious. So interesting. In the sense that people are seeing similarity in the way they think with what was traditionally seen as people quite opposite types.
Yeah, exactly. And they're not really opposite. The only way that they're opposite is if they've got the volume turned up so loud on their dominant process.
I'm interested about the whole idea of opposites. In what way, do you understand that word now? How do you define the kind of relationship which different preferences have, for instance, or different styles?
Well, I think of these things as filters. So when somebody is talking about something, like if you were doing an interview with somebody and I didn't already know their preferences, I would hear some things. There are now 4 lenses. There's the whole type lens, which not many people can do. I can say that I do it pretty well because of all the years that I participated in the type resources program where we had the 16 personality types. Each type presented themselves to the group. So I had years of that, sometimes 10 trainings a year for 4 years. So that's whole type, and then cognitive dynamics gives us the processes of that. So living systems, principle, patterns, rule, processes. Now I forgot what your question was. Oh, so I have that lens. It's like a colored lens. And if you put on that lens, it filters out what is appropriate to that lens, like with essential motivators. What are the core needs, talents, values? And this other thing, what is that? So it makes us, having all of these different lenses, more careful in what we attribute something to. And it just, everything is a clue about what somebody's preference is. And so I run it through all of these filters. And we can have somebody in a class with INTJ preferences we're in the Essential Motivators class right now, so that's on my mind. And they might be talking about theorist, but not what they're wanting and what they are describing with their desire to plan and anticipate is really interaction styles, because it's not my variety of theorist. So then that lens kind of narrows down and sort of like hits the nail on the head, because if you don't hit the nail on the head, you're going to have a hole in the wall. So you'll have some hole or some erroneous. Doing self-discovery work with people is very serious, because I know people who've been mistyped, either through professional work or their own decisions. And they live their lives trying to be that type, and it does not work because their core needs don't get satisfied. So I would say like INTP, ENTP, not a huge difference, because all of those different lenses happen to match up, except for get things going and behind the scenes, or extroversion and introversion. But the cognitive processes are the same. They're also the same theorist pattern, the same so there's only one thing, which is not so interaction styles are important. But if you looked at me, sometimes you say, well, yeah, I think she's kind of get things going. But not very many people would say that of me. But in certain contexts, I'm very talkative, very interested in what's going on with the group and having people be involved. So anyway.
So is there any one of the lenses then where you see more frequently that it's the one that helps people reassess what they thought their type was and really kind of opens up a new way of looking at it?
I don't know if I can answer that. It all depends. What I see most is what doesn't work. And that's trying to figure out what your best fit type is by looking at the 8 functions.
Tell me
and
more.
That's how, thanks. I would love to tell you more. One of my charging white horse issues, it's patterns, living systems, all can be described. If you want to understand a living system, you have to understand the pattern. That's the core driver of a system, living system. Then there are processes. This is the work of Fritjof Capra. So there, who studied living systems, and he's a physicist, but multi. What is the word? Lots of different bodies of knowledge. Okay, so patterns stay the same. They can vary in what they look like, but the essential qualities of the pattern are still the same. So theorist, for example, I have those core needs that go way back. I can remember, I can reflect on my childhood, I can see where I had the most problems with those core needs, not getting those met, and the most insecurities, actually. Processes are activities that maintain the pattern. So one of the things that I learned facilitating groups and becoming a therapist is that if I didn't develop extroverted feeling, like it wasn't conscious, but this was a learning, if I didn't develop some capacity to attend to what's important to someone else, I was not going to succeed. So in the interest of my competency need, I think, I developed more extroverted feeling capacities.
Mm.
And it turned out that my business partner had preferences for ENFJ. My neighbor who worked for me had preferences for ESFJ. I had continually relationships with people with ENFJ preferences. And that has been, those were my, I mean, it just happened. I didn't say, oh, I'm going to go make friends with someone with those preferences. It just enabled me to do that. So the processes, though, can, if we could get skilled in those processes. So if you looked at me, and there's another thing about this life purpose. So I did some purpose work and it turned out healer. And I went, no, you got to be kidding me. But it turns out that's really what makes my heart sing, is when somebody feels better about themselves and knows themselves. I don't deal with trauma, but sometimes it does release trauma. So, and then if we now look at Dario's 4 different patterns and all of these other things, it makes sense. So the kind of INTP that I represent is really different than the kind of INTP someone else represents with a different type pattern. INTJ, for example, we're both theorists, or we could have, yeah. And then there's some people with INTP, forget that, who really, I don't know, they seem just quite different than me. And so, but the core is the same.
Mm.
And so there are always variations. And when you look at patterns, those, when you get to the essence of the pattern, not something that's a peripheral thing that you see in 1 or 2 or 3 people, but something that fits all 4 of the types within that pattern, then you're getting at this pattern. But when you look at the processes, that's where we grow and develop. That's what type development's all about. It doesn't change our type. It changes the way we express our type. And so processes, when you try to figure them out, first of all, I think it's challenging to really describe them in a way that's going to fit all the ways it can express. So part of this is kind of typical INTP. I'm continually working on the definitions of things like the 8 functions. And you see that with John Beebe, with ENTP too. We're constantly, refining those definitions so that they're more accurate. And because I want it to relate, if I'm going to put it as a description, I want it to relate to every person with that pattern for the most part.
Mm.
But when you look at the 8 functions, those processes, and I could look at processes like abstract language and concrete language, or affiliative pragmatic. Those are the essential motivator processes. You can look at variables about that. I certainly look pretty affiliative a lot of the time, but that's not my inclination, but I look that way. So, and anyway, so trying to figure out, and then with the 8 functions, the big issue is that introverted thinking looks very different when it's in a young, mature, kind of young, just their essence of it, versus what it looks like when it's a more mature person. And then John Beebe has those. John Beebe has those 3.
Persona, ego, self.
Yeah, the persona, the ego, the self, or ego persona, whichever it is. Persona sends out to protect somebody. So that not only do they look different at different levels of maturity, they look different in where that process is in the pattern. So if you were going to use those processes to identify your best fit type, you would have to understand all those variations. And I don't think that's happening.
I guess I agree with you in that, if you look at your current developed state, as in like intentional access or skill or ability to use the functions, then it can be immensely confusing because you're looking at someone's development on top of their type disposition, and I guess
Right.
it's quite a lot of work to separate that from the earlier disposition. And I guess what John Beebe's saying is, that we've all got all of these functions, but there's ways that they come out that we don't have choice over. There's ways that they can express archetypally. Do you bring
Right.
the archetypal aspect into your work as well, or is that not part?
Yes and no. I mean, to the degree of, the parent, the good parent, um, the child, the ones that John Beebe talks about. There are other archetypes, and I did attend an archetype webinar workshop once recently. And it was interesting because I think that archetypes, the way they were talking about it, I can't remember their names. They're associated with CAPT. So anyway, the way they were talking about them, it makes sense that I could archetypally be a priest or an artist or whatever the stereotypic archetypal descriptions are. So that I could see how looking at studying these different archetypes that they've identified would be helpful in helping people identify their purpose in life, seeing kind of other aspects, variations on the patterns. John Beebe's archetypes are the way he uses those archetypes in relationship to the position in the pattern, like leading role. I call it leading role. He calls it heroic. And I can't remember what I call it the aspirational. I can't remember what that is. It's the spine of the personality. So at any rate, I think that they're useful. Just like trauma work is useful to help people unpack. I mean, in severe trauma, people may take on a whole different personality pattern, completely different. I've seen a couple of cases of that. I've had people come who were traumatized and they couldn't find their best fit type until they had the trauma work done. And it didn't take much trauma work before they could start to own what their best fit was. So that kind of goes back to the pathology stuff I had.
That's interesting background to bring into that, whereas the MBTI was more in a personal development context, and yet Jung himself was dealing with pathology, and as do Jungian analysts to this day. So just want to wrap up with a last question, really, of your sort of thoughts for the future of typology. Given you've lived through the big boom in the United States, coming into every organization, and then see being like this kind of resistance from academic psychology over the years, and where it is now with with online and technology having changed a lot of things and access. Where do you see it going over the next few decades? Have you got any visions for that?
Well, I'm not really good about foresight, but I can tell you what my fears are.
Sure, go ahead.
I mean, I think that when you only look at one model, you're likely to describe that model inaccurately. So, and this is probably a particularly INTP concern, but I still think it has merit, that some of what's out there and available is people who have taught themselves through various things they've read. It's not like everybody has to take my classes to be smart in this stuff, although I think it's a good idea. But people tend to interpret things through their own lenses and their own experiences. And so then they're writing things. And if they're writing things only knowing one model, or they're looking at just the processes, they may not be accurate. So first of all, I think multiple models that are compatible. There's some models, the Enneagram, I don't think fits. Great on its own, just don't mix it with type, because you're going to get strange results. But that kind of mixing and matching as if it's a cake that we're baking, we're dealing with living systems, and living systems have meaning and purpose, and they're in patterns. And so my concern is that sometimes with the wonders of the web, you may not be getting the best information. And then the fascination with the 8 functions, I don't quite understand what it is, but I think it has to do with wanting freedom and to not be stereotyped. But I'm not sure why it's so fascinating to so many young people. And so I'm not really paying much, I don't really know what the trends are. It's just that I know how many people come into my classes who are coming from that and how inaccurate their understandings are. There are several people like that. I think still in the business world, it's test and tell, and that's the other big concern. Take the instrument, here are your results. And once people get those results, that they tend to trust them. And we used to do University of Toyota classes. I didn't do them, but my colleague Linda Ernst did. And we would do self-discovery with temperament and self-discovery with interaction styles. And they would figure out what fit them. And then we developed an instrument or two for those models. And we'd give people that instrument at the beginning of the workshop. And at the end, Linda would say, so what are you relating to? And the people who had already self-selected one thing, if the instrument was different, a lot of people chose the instrument. So, what is it going to take to make the world a better place? Increase self-awareness. Does that help their self-awareness? I don't think so. Does that help their ability to, get along with people and shift their perspectives? Hard to do when you don't know your own. You don't know what you're shifting from. So those are my concerns, and they have been for years. Where it's going, I think as long as people keep signing up for my trainings, some of the other trainings, it'll be fine because there are people following the rules, following the best practices, really.
Well, it's great that you're doing that, and you've developed your practices over the years, and you're bringing them to people to share that still in workshops. So I hope people will check out your website. What is the website if they want to learn more?
Well, the most current and up-to-date one is InterStrength.org. InterStrength. So inter, like internal or interpersonal, but it's the INTER, and then strength.
Yeah.
So finding our internal strength and our interpersonal strength. And it's .org. But if you go to .com, we own that. It'll send you there. LindaBerens.com is not totally up to date, but there are some things there that are not on the other website. So.
Well, thank you so much for coming along and sharing with us today.
Thank you. My pleasure. It was fun.
Yeah, great. You love talking about this stuff, yeah. And it is really interesting. And I hope we see you again at another BAPT conference in the future as well.
I will probably submit if I remember to do it before the deadline in December.
Be wonderful, yeah. I look forward to it. And if not, we'll hopefully come to APTI events and very much be part of the community and see you there. So thanks again, Linda.
Yeah, I'm not going to retire, just by the way.
So. Good. I hope not. Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much. It was a very, very fun thing to do today. Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.